Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Dr. Haifaa Jawad. You're most welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Assalamu alaikum to you.
Walaikum assalam.
Dr. Haifaa is an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. She holds a PhD from the University of Exeter, also in the UK, and has held teaching positions at several academic institutions, including West Hill College, New England College, Trinity College in Dublin, and the University of Alabama. She focuses her research on the socio-political study of Islam and Muslims, and she's currently working on a project on the universal principles of the Quran related to gender. Today, Dr. Haifaa will be discussing Islam and feminism, a very controversial subject in many ways. So would you like to introduce us to the subject?
Yeah, thanks a lot. When we talk about Islam and feminism, it is really very difficult, in my view, to combine the two terms, primarily because they represent two different perspectives, and hence when we mix them together, when we say labels such as Islamic feminism or feminist Islam are really not correct. To understand that, we will try and define the terms to show why these two terms are not really compatible. So, for example, when we talk about feminism, what is feminism? In general, feminism is a human ideology, while Islam is called by Muslims as al-Din, revealed religion. And as such, there is a difference between the notion of ideology and the principle of revealed religion. Ideology signifies much more the efforts of individuals to formulate values with a view to establishing a system and on the basis of reason and aided by revelation. Whereas al-Din or Islam, as we say it, is a far more comprehensive term, describing the totality of life and implying a primary orientation towards the divine as the source of final authority. And as such, to talk of a religious ideology, such as feminist Islam or Islamic feminism, is thus a fundamental contradiction in terms and betrays in reality a confusion as to what religion is in its essence, which is, of course, divine revelation.
Right. Interesting.
When we talk about feminism and gender issues, there are, historically speaking, three movements that have dealt with gender in Islam or women in Islam. And these are Western feminism, secular feminism, I call them, and Islamic feminism. And these three movements in general, they tend to claim that they provide alternative universal models that are contemporary and opposed to the traditional Quranic Islamic model, which they say is patriarchal and out of date. And as such, these actually movements have had negative impact in general on the overall position of Muslim women by distorting, in my opinion, and confusing the authentic position of genders in the Quran and by extension Islam. And hence the aim here is to give a critique of these tendencies that are predominantly secular, modernist, to gender discourse in comparison with the traditional Islamic approach. Let's start with Western feminist approach or Western feminism in general. This movement is a predominantly ethno-Eurocentric movement in its approach.
So if I could just clarify, by ethno-Eurocentric, you mean it has its origins obviously in Europe, physically in Europe, in presumably France,
Yes.
Germany, England, and later in the United States, and it comes in that part of the world. So it's not really universal. It's very specific to a particular part of the world and its culture and its history. Would that be fair?
Yes, and then it actually spread to the rest of the world, including the Muslim world. But originally, as you said, rightly speaking, predominantly emerged, sort of in England, Europe, and America, and then after that, to the rest of the world, including the Muslim world.
Okay, thank you.
This movement would continue to look at Islam, among other religions, as patriarchal and anti-women. And in general, this movement is unable, in my opinion, or unwilling to really understand the philosophy of Islam on women's rights and the relationship between men and women in society. It was and continues to lump Muslim women into one large group and then view them as homogeneous, leaving aside the geographical, political, socio-cultural, theological, and historical factors that really shape their lives in different parts of the world. In other words, all these issues are not really taken into consideration, and they, in one way or another, affect the position of Muslim women right throughout the Muslim world. So they have to be taken into consideration. They do not they just put them together and they say Muslim women such and such.
And that's just quite an essentializing or patronizing approach, isn't it? To lump together all these diverse groups of people from different cultures and backgrounds, as you say, and just label them, Muslim women is really quite reductionist and essentializing in a way that doesn't acknowledge the dignity and diversity, as I say, of people. And that's quite a negative thing you're saying, though, I think.
Yeah, indeed, one of the major weaknesses of this movement. They don't do that, for example, with Christianity or Judaism, but in particularly they focus on Islam in this context, and hence this is a major weakness in their approach. And although there are some problems facing Muslim women, but these challenges really, when we look at the situation of Muslim women, come from social attitudes related to gender issues rather than from Islam per se, in my view. And this issue is by no means confined to Islam. Other religions have the same problems. Nonetheless, Western feminists tend to focus predominantly on gender in Islam and overlook the oppressive situation of genders in other religions.
Sorry to interrupt, but why do Western feminists then, from this particular part of the planet, Europe and perhaps America, why are they so fixated and obsessed, seemingly, by Muslims and Islam? What's going on there? Is this because of the long-term civilizational divide between the West and the Muslim world? Is that why it does that, or are there other reasons why they're so fixated on Muslims and Islam?
I guess, and we will mention that later on. It's to do with colonization, images of colonial powers, and the view of the relationship between men and women in Islam, a sense of cultural superiority in comparison, and we will mention that in the process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, this group or this movement in general tend to analyze the position of Muslim women in absolutely objective, inverted comma terms, in ostensibly rather objective terms, while allowing their own cultural prejudices to fashion the lens through which they view and thus distort the spiritual and social dimensions of Islam. When we look at their methodology, it must be understood in the context of the social science approach, which in general abandons religion as an instrument of analysis. So they really don't take into consideration the role of religion or the importance of religion, and in this context, Islam. And as such, when we look at their research on Muslim women, we see that they tend to analyze it or analyze the position of Muslim women in socio-economic and political terms, ignoring in one way or another the relevance of Islam as an issue of identity to Muslim women, who tend to be predominantly comfortable with their religious identities. So most Muslim women, are comfortable with being Muslims and with religious or Islamic identities. But the Western feminists, they really ignore that, and they never take that into consideration when they assess or when they research the position of women in Islam.
That's interesting. If I may say, just going back to that, it seems that that approach, where you say that Muslim women, research on Muslim women tend to analyze it in socio-economic and political terms. That reminds me quite a lot of a Marxist kind of materialist methodology, where discounting religion as a serious existential identitarian reality and reducing everything, as you say there, to economic and social or political structures. But of course, this overlooks, as you say, the Muslim women as human beings identifying with faith, which is essential to their existence, to their deen, their whole life. But it's been reduced to these kind of Western post-Enlightenment materialist categories, which Marxism obviously is the supreme example of that, and thus missing the point. I think that's what you're trying to say, isn't it? They're not actually grasping with the profound meaning that Islam gives to people's lives. And I just finally in this, that I was told recently that most converts to Islam in the United Kingdom are women. Actually, they're not men, and this shows that Islam has enormous appeal to often very intelligent, mature women who freely embrace this extraordinary faith. So anyway, just wanted to share that.
Yes, it is important, especially with regard to the spiritual aspect of Islam, the meaning, that Islam gives to life and to women in this context, not only purely materialism. It's the whole concept of, modern and postmodern ideologies, which is based on, materialism, that if you achieve materialism, if you become a high sky person, if you own bigger properties and etc., then you will be happy, leaving aside the spiritual vacuums which materialism usually has created. And hence a lot of people, and among them women, tend to look for a meaning in life, and the meaning comes from the spiritual side of the faith, in this context, Islam.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Their approach, as well, as I just mentioned, is colored and shaped by the colonial images of the male-female relationship in Islam, which in one way or another underpins a sense of superiority in Western culture and the inferiority of Eastern, especially Muslim culture. So that is their approach in one way or another, is being their approach to Islam is being affected by this mentality, a sense of cultural superiority. And this sense of superiority advocates that Muslim women need to be liberated from Islam. And to be liberated means that they have to cast off everything Islamic and adopt a Western way of life.
I see this particularly in France, by the way, where I spend a lot of my time. It's that what you've just said there. is just exactly what I see in the political, social discourse in the French Republic all the time.
Yes, it is. And as such, what did they do actually, which is essential, is that they applauded and they accepted and the so-called, I call them secular Muslim feminists, who have managed in way, we're going to talk about secular Muslim feminists later on, but they accepted them, they applauded them because they thought that they managed to get rid of their inverted comma horrific religious heritage. And what did they do as well, apart from accepting them and applauded them? They offered them a platform to express their views, which we will mention later on. But women who disagree with their approach are accused of caving into patriarchal, and they accuse them of working against feminists who, according to them, struggled to advance women's rights. So those who agree with them, they accept them, they give them a platform to express their views, while those who disagree with them actually accuse them of being caving into patriarchal, conservatives, backward, and they denied, they were not allowed to have a platform to argue their case. And as a result of that, this approach in general has alienated many Muslim women from taking seriously the views of Western feminists. They really never, particularly those women who are keen to keep their Islamic identities, were and are unhappy with Western feminist approach, and they think that in one way and another alien to traditional Islam. We'll move on to the secular Muslim Islamic feminists. These are the other two feminist movements that have dealt with gender issues in Islam or women in Islam. The first one, I label them secular Muslim feminism, and the second is called Islamic feminism. And really the main difference between the two is the methodology and the ideology they follow in relations to gender issues in Islam. They are Muslims, both of them, but the methodology they adopted differs, and we will talk about that in a minute. Historically speaking, secular feminism emerged in the Muslim world and was and still is regarded as one of the pioneering brand in the Muslim area. From the beginning, they identified themselves with Western secular tendencies in society, predominantly the tendencies of the upper and upper middle classes, that is in Muslim countries. And this movement gained strength and momentum in post-colonial era and dominated the political scene in many parts of the Muslim world for some time, mainly because the dominant political discourse in the post-colonial era was secular nationalist, and hence in tune with what they were looking for. And this movement or discourse adopted in general the notion of granting women rights and reform along European lines. While Muslims themselves, they regard Islam as a purely cultural phenomenon. And their ideological orientation is predominantly secular, modern, and hence treat the subject of women in Islam or gender in Islam not from the Islamic worldview, but from that of modern Western thought. and most of them are really, in one way or another, openly opposed to any role of Islam in the domain of gender relations. And some of them even questioned the authority of the Quran.
Gosh. Mm.
And this form of feminism was and continues to be seen as part of secular nationalist ideology, which was associated in the Muslim world with failure, defeat, and betrayal, and hence it lacks authenticities, at least from a Muslim woman perspective.
I mean, this, if I could just pop in there, often in the West, we don't, in many people in the West, secularism, like in France, obviously, and America and so on, is seen as a good thing, and it's prized and extolled in the public realm. But in the Muslim world, the experience of secularism is very, very different, isn't it? It's one of oppression, colonialism. It's one of alien ideologies coming in, seeking to redefine or tell people what they should believe from outside. And it's a very different experience, isn't it, in the Muslim world? And so that's why most Muslim people are not rushing to accept secularism, because of their very bad experience of it. Would that be crude but fair?
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. And not only the bad experience of colonialism, but also the post-colonial era, where all the nationalist leaders were in general secular and nationalist. They didn't give the Muslim world anything but defeat, betrayal, and sort of major problems. And as such, the failure of the nationalist secularists in the Muslim world is there lingering in the mind of the Muslims, and because of the organic association of this movement, which is secular feminism, with the secular nationalist ideologies that emerged in post-colonial era, then the Muslim world look at this, and say, oh, no, we don't want them because they didn't give us but failure, defeat, and betrayal. And they look at them as well that they are not authentic because they adopted Western modern approach rather than Islamic approach.
And of course, contrasting that with the example of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, who's a very noble example of humanity, the best of humanity, with his treatment of women, of course, and other people. There's no competition, is there? So, obviously, a human being will be attracted to that noble example rather than the, as you say, the defeat and betrayal and disappointment of the secular ideologies.
Indeed, and as a result of that, as I said, they have alienated large sections of Muslim women and men anyway. Right. Apart from that, the advocates of this form of feminisms, their really credentials are questioned, because the majority of them were and are not theologically qualified to pass or to make a theological judgment on the question of gender in the Quran. Right. And in reality, most of them, if not all of them, are very often either sociologists, anthropologists, or political scientists, or even medical doctors like former Nawal Saadawi, putting them in one way or another in no really credible position to comment on theological issues. This is very crucial, because how could, for example, one who's not qualified, theologically speaking, to really talk about sort of women in the Quran or in the Sunnah or in Islamic thought. So their credentials are really questioned, and consequently, a lot of Muslim women and men do not take their judgments into consideration as a result of their academic credentials.
Understandably, I suppose, yeah.
All right. This form of, sort of movement in recent years have came under heavy pressure, and indeed it has created what they call it a backlash, since it alienated large sections of Muslim men and women who really want a change, as I said, but not at the expense of their Islamic identities. And hence, its specific impact, despite the fact that it emerged after the post-colonial era, but really, and became popular in the West. In the Muslim world, their impact has been very specific, primarily because of what we said just now, that they adopted their approach, modernist, secularist approach. They oppose Islam in one way or another. They regard Islam as purely cultural, could be changed here and there, the way we like it, the way we don't like it. And as such, as I said, its impact has been very limited. But having said that, however, this movement is still active in parts of the Muslim world and has followers among predominantly secular sections of Muslim society. So secularism is still important in parts of the Muslim world, and consequently those sections do accept what they advocate in this context regarding women in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, this, as I said, we'll move now into the other form of feminism, which I call it Islamic feminism. And historically speaking, this movement is actually started in the 19th centuries when we are told voices were raised concerning women's situation. But those voices were suppressed for political and religious reasons. But the movement re-emerged in the 70s.
Right.
Primarily because of the emergence of so-called political Islam or Islamism, which was in general hostile to women's rights when they emerged, really. But then later on gained momentum because of certain reasons, among them United Nations Decade of Women in 1975, with emphasis on the rights of women to have education and to play a role in public life. And of course, there was emphasis on the position of women in that context. So that actually gave them momentum. Then the impact of the so-called globalization, which led some Muslims to rethink of Muslims' situations in the light of the modern reality. So Westernization or globalization spread right throughout the world. And within that context, some Muslim men and women started to rethink the position of Muslim women in light of the modern reality. Another reason which gave momentum to Islamic feminism is actually what they call it, the limitation of secular feminism, which we talked about just now. The impact of secular feminism was really very specific and limited, and that paved the way for Islamic feminism to take over in a way and to start affect the views of women in some Muslim countries and the diaspora. Another reason which gave momentum to Islamic feminism is the work of diasporic Muslim women, both seculars and activists. A lot of, in reality, diasporic Muslim women in Europe and in America in particular played and continue to play a major role in this in the in this issue, in the context of Muslim women and Islam and Islamic feminism. Another reason that gave momentum to Islamic feminism, the emergence of the Islamic feminism, is the impact of September 11 attacks. After the attacks, there was, in one way or another, a heightened interest in Islam, Muslim people, and Islamic feminism. And as such, a link was established between Muslim women, especially veiled ones, and terrorist violence. And Western media at that time started to say that Muslim, especially Muslim fundamentalists, they oppress women, and as a result of that, Muslim women need to be liberated. And that was one of the reasons or justifications presented by George Bush and his group, that we need to go to Afghanistan to liberate Afghani women because
I've often heard people, particularly Christians, say in this country, in Britain, quite liberal, lefty, well-meaning Christians say, yeah, we need to be in Afghanistan, we need to invade the country to liberate Muslim women. And these people didn't know anything about Afghanistan, but they tended to agree with the neocon Bush administration in this. So ironically, you had a right-left alliance, actually, for a brief time anyway, about the invasion of Muslim countries, not just Afghanistan, of course, Iraq as well, and Libya, and the list is quite long. But yeah, absolutely.
Yes, indeed. And as a result of that, what did they do? The plight really of Muslim women was started to be used to reinforce the thesis of the clash of civilizations, that really Muslim women are oppressed because of Islam and Muslim fundamentalists, and we as the West, we have so a civilized people, and we usually liberate women, and consequently the thesis of the class of civilizations were really employed in this context. When we look at Islamic feminism, let's just see what approach they have, and whether really in reality reflects genuine Islamic tradition with regard to genders in Islam. So this really brand of feminism claims, at least verbally, that it is authentic on the basis that it works within the context of the Islamic framework. So they said, oh, well, we are totally different from some secular Muslims because we look at the Quran and Hadith and Islamic law. So we look within the context of Islamic framework. And they said that we wanted to reinterpret Islamic religious texts, mainly the Quran, from, inverted comma, a women-friendly perspective. And as such, their aim is to establish what they call it modern fiqh nisa, or jurisprudence of women to deal with gender issues, which is of course essential in this context. And they justify this attempt, the attempt to reinterpret Islamic sources, particularly the Quran. They justify it on the basis that the traditional interpretations of Islamic sources are really patriarchal and biased against women. And they want to challenge them by giving their own interpretations on issues related to gender rights, especially those within the personal law of the Sharia. So they say the traditional Islamic interpretations are really patriarchal, against women. We can't accept them, especially in light of modern reality. Let's just try ourselves to look at the at Islamic texts and reinterpret them to give what they call it a women-friendly interpretations of gender in Islam. And this brand does not form, when we look at it in reality, a coherent group with a clear strategy, except really to criticize the traditional scholars. It is more or less fragmented with no proper coordination between the advocates. And sometimes they even contradict each other in their writings. And most of these advocates, they really live in the Western world, in Europe and in America. Very few you could find them in the Muslim world. Their approach in general is a modernist approach, which is again is a Western construct, an alien in one way or another to traditional Islam, and can easily lead, in my opinion, if it is applied, to the deconstruction of the holy texts of Islam, especially the Quran, which is the focus of this brand of feminism. They, sort of women such as Amina Wadud in general focused on the Quran and tried to reinterpret that from a modernist perspective. And in my opinion, this could lead, later on, if it continues, to the deconstruction of the text. And although they claim to work within the Islamic faith, their approach or methods, in my opinion, are in reality opposed to Islam, because it is a modernist Western approach. And hence the potential damage they could do to the faith is really very apparent, is more apparent than the damage the secular feminists could do to the faith, because they work from within.
And yet the ideology, as you say, the ideology these so-called Islamic feminists are using is not indigenous to Islam. It doesn't come organically from Muslim or Islamic civilization, which is an incredibly rich and vast corpus of spiritualities and knowledge and so on. It comes from a Western tradition, which, as you've said, is profoundly anti-religious. It pushes religion and identity and spirituality out and focuses on, as you say, the socio-economic and political structures. So it's a fundamental different paradigm that's operating here and they're trying to mix the two. They've got the Islamic paradigm and the modernist paradigm from the West, and they're trying to fuse them together. And you're saying it doesn't work, and it does potential damage, as you say, to...
It does, yeah, it does. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It does, in my opinion, lead to the deconstruction of the religion, as it happens with the Christianity anyway.
Yeah.
All right. When they speak, these secular Islamic feminists, when they speak of their efforts to reform Islam, in my opinion, they are not aware of the difference between two essential things in this context. And the first one, revivalism or tajdeed, which is reform of Islah. So in my opinion, when they are not clear about these issues, because revivalism or tajdeed, it's an Islamic concept, and traditionally and historically means the inner revival of Islam from within, and always associated with prominent mujaddideen such as Al-Ghazali and others.
Yeah.
While the latter, the reform of Islah, is really purely modern construct, Western construct, and has no Islamic origin whatsoever.
Exactly. So people like Germaine Greer, people like Simone de Beauvoir, the partner of Jean-Paul Sartre. She was heavily influenced, of course, by Karl Marx, by Marxism, as well as Sartre. So it's a very, very different source of ideology and ideas than the It's not coming from within Islam. It's coming from antithetical ideologies that reject revelation, because secularism and Marxism are simply hostile and reject revelation completely. So the question then is, how can you bring these two fundamentally different worldviews into connection with each other, into synthesis? And of course, you're saying they can't be.
Impossible, to be honest, and whether they are aware of that or not is another matter. I think in general they are not aware of that. They might be genuine, but really their approach is totally difficult approach and wrong approach, and consequently they need to rethink their approach if they wanted to really achieve something good for genders in Islam. As I said, they seem to be confused and unaware of the difference between revivalism and reform. And nonetheless, the advocates of this form of feminism can't be really in one way or another labeled as theologians. So although they claim to work within the context of Islam, and they go to the Quran, they use the Hadith, and etc., and they try to reinterpret that, we can't really in one way or another call them as proper theologians, in my opinion. When you look at them, predominantly they do not have deep Islamic knowledge that allow them to claim that they are scholars of Quranic exegesis, and therefore have the right to change the divine rules, to do some tafsir. Impossible to do so. And I think in general, they have no right as a result of that to change the divine rules. And they have, as a result of that, borrowed heavily from Christian and Jewish feminist theologies, mainly liberation theologies.
Yeah, which itself, by the way, is heavily borrowed from Marxism. Let's go back to that again. Liberation theology has its explicit roots in political liberation theology as well in Marxism.
Indeed, you're right. And let's just see their approach. In their tools of analysis, they use Western feminist theories despite the claim to do otherwise. And they question, and we will talk about that later on, as a result of that, they question the relevance of the Sunnah and the law to modern life. And some even advocated the abandonment of the Sunnah altogether and focus only on the Quran, as we said, like Amina Wadud and the likes. And this is done really without an in-depth study of the importance of the Sunnah in the life of Muslims, and most importantly, on no important studies on the organic relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. Because, of course, without the Sunnah, it is impossible to apply the Quran in Muslim life. Exactly. So when they focus on the Quran only and they abandon the Sunnah, they say the Sunnah is not relevant, they really, this is why I'm saying they really are in one way or another paving the way to the deconstruction of the religion, because they separate the Sunnah from the Quran. Exactly. And they do not, in my opinion, understand that there is important relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. For the Sunnah explains everything in the Quran, and we have to follow that as a result of that. So when you separate that, when you abandon that, you're really left with the Quran, and the Quran can't help without the Sunnah.
Yeah.
Finally, there is also, when we talk about Islamic feminism, there is also the issue of the name of this brand. The majority of the proponents of this movement describe themselves as feminists and Muslims. But based on what we discussed really earlier, how can they harmonize these two different understandings? Difficult, in my opinion, to really put them together, to harmonize them. Why? Because, as I said earlier, feminism, human-made ideology that does not allow any bearing of religion on gender issues, and between the divine revelation, or al-din as we say in Arabic, that insists on the importance of Islam in defining the role and life of genders. So to put that together, it just crazy, in my opinion. And
I think what you're saying is so important there, and in my opinion, it applies way beyond the particular issues to do with so-called Islamic feminism and Islam. Often Western ideology itself on any subject, was in the sciences, in philosophy, in political discourse, rejects the metaphysical dimension of reality. It rejects revelation. It rejects God. So it really is a godless ideology all around, and we see its impact particularly in this kind of hybrid thing called Islamic feminism. There's incompatibility, as you say, between these two different understandings. But it's not just a question of ideology; it's a whole metaphysical, philosophical dimension missing in the West's conception. It rejects God, revelation, metaphysics, and all that, and that makes it very potentially toxic, but also incompatible at the fundamental level. And this is the problem. And so this idea of Islamic feminism seems very kind of, well, not as unnatural, but a very awkward juxtaposition of ideologies, given their metaphysical differences.
Unfortunately, but it has become a prominent movement, particularly really in the West. And my concern is, of course, the impact of this movement on young women, particularly in the West and even in the Muslim world, who, in one way or another, it is driving them into a path of secular way of life rather than traditional way of life, which is essential. And it respects women. It has given women rights 14 centuries, and maybe at a certain stage we could talk about that, about gender issues in Islam, and then compare it to feminism, and how really Islamic feminism, in my opinion, is more dangerous. It has potential a threat to the religion than even Western feminism or secular feminism, as I said, because they deal with the Islamic text. Finally, my conclusion is that there is no doubt that there are some problems facing Muslim women in most Muslim countries, as well as in the diaspora. There's no doubt about that. And that there are reasons behind that, social, political, economic reasons. Not, in my opinion, Islam per se. But in order to rectify the situation, Muslims, in my opinion, they do not need to borrow foreign modes that do not fit them, or try to change or bend the divine principles to try and say, oh, well, let's just improve the situation of Muslim women, particularly in modern life. Rather, in my opinion, is to practice genuinely Islamic principles that are universal and suit the nature, the fitrah of the male and the female, primarily, and they primarily aim to achieve justice, which is essential.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Okay, well, there we go. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Dr. Haifaa. Thank you so much for that. Very clear and insightful analysis of the fundamental differences between these different understandings of reality. And I think that's often not explored, is it? We often get a surface kind of argument about individual laws or individual views about, say, inheritance or this or that, but you're looking deeper at the fundamental understandings of these two paradigms and saying, you know, that they're not necessarily compatible.
No, not at all. And actually, it came from a long and experience of teaching gender in Islam, and then later on teaching feminism. And then while doing that, I discovered the contradictions between the traditional Islamic perspectives on female-male relationship, and of course the feminist one. And then I became even more interested in Islamic feminism, and after again long studies of the movement, I discovered that really the label is or the adjective is Islamic, but it is not really in reality.
On the outside of the tin, it has the word Islam, but inside the tin, it's not. But what I'm interested, you're an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham, obviously a distinguished scholar. You've written, I haven't mentioned, by the way, all your books and periodicals and articles and chapters of books that you contribute to. Is a very long list, and if people look you up on the University of Birmingham website, they'll see all your qualifications which are very extensive. But my reason for mentioning all that is, when you express your understandings and concerns to your colleagues, presumably at the University of Exeter, Birmingham, I mean, in other contexts in the West, do they listen to you? Is there an attempt to understand how Muslim women actually live their lives and experience the Sunnah, or are they really so blinkered now that you are pessimistic about any dialogue and any advancing understanding of the issues?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult, of course. You have students from different backgrounds, and I guess some, not all, some of Muslim women tend to understand that and to appreciate that. Others who are very much have secular premises would not appreciate that. I think some Christians and Jewish, they do, few, not much anyway. I guess those Christian, Judeo-Christian students who have Judeo-Christian heritage, background and premises, they might sort of appreciate that. And the same with Muslim women. But those, whether Muslims or Christians and Jews with secular premises, they do not appreciate that. And definitely they don't accept. And I guess secular feminists like Nawal Saadawi, Fatima Menisi, and the like, and Islamic feminists like Mawdudi, Asma Balas and Rafat Hassan, they would not as well accept my approach, definitely. They would say this is a conservative approach, and etc., etc. But I think the traditional Islamic perspective to gender issues is essential, and it's in the interest of Muslim women to follow that. It's not patriarchy at all, it's hierarchy, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, you need to have, when you know, in a family, you have to have, you know what I mean, you have to have a hierarchy, exactly, in the state. So they are confusing again patriarchy with hierarchy. Right? And Islam is not a patriarch, it's not advocating patriarchal family structure. It's actually, there is a hierarchy, which of course you need to, in order, you know, to look after the family. So it's essential to make a difference between these two concepts as well.
Just my final question, if I may. I mentioned earlier in the United Kingdom, and it's well established empirically that most converts to Islam, and they're an increasing number. There's been a huge surge in converts to Islam in Britain. I'm not sure why. Well, I can guess why. There might be some prominent social media personalities who've also converted to Islam, making it much more attractive. But my question really is, why do you think so many women, particularly in our postmodern feminist culture, are embracing Islam in the United Kingdom?
I guess it's to do with spiritual fulfillment. The spiritual side of Islam is really very rich, and it's very positive in one way or another toward women as well. There's absolute, for example, equality between men and women when it comes to the relationship between men and women and the ultimate reality. Yep. And there is emphasis on as well a sacred role of female, particularly in the family, in comparison with modern role of women in family or in society. And that's what attracts them, in my opinion. So the spiritual side is essential, and maybe social issues within the context of Islam, the strong family relationship and the relationship within the community. All these are crucial because women do need families, do need in one way or another protection, not in a degrading way as it's portrayed within the context of feminism, but in terms of, sort of nice family, strong relationship, protecting each other, helping each other, being with you or with me in time of difficulties and in times of prosperity. So these I think issues have in one way or another encouraged Muslim women particularly to embrace Islam.
Okay. Well, if I ask you one more question, so I said that was the last question. I've now got another last question. Sorry. What do you? I always ask my distinguished guests, such as yourself, this question. At least I try and remember to. What are you working on at the moment in terms of academic work and book production?
There's a book in the pipeline, but it's on female spirituality in Islam, by taking, of course, case studies. So that will be probably a co-authored book. But I have just finished a paper which will be discussed in a conference in Paris in May on the universal principles of the Quran with emphasis on gender issues in Islam, trying to stress that the traditional Islamic model of gender relations is really in reality a universal one. It suits everyone, right? And of course I argue in favor of it against secular and Islamic feminism.
Right. Oh, excellent. I'll try and put some links in the description below to your work, so people can follow up and read your excellent work. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Haifaa Jawad, for your time. I think you're in Jordan at the moment. Is that right? Is that where you're?
Yes, I am. Yes, I have a research paper to work on.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And maybe, inshallah, we will talk again. Till next time.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thank you for having me. Take care.